Along the unbroken chain of racism that links America past to its present, there have been 2 points when the federal government, otherwise complicit or complacent, saw the mistreatment of African Americans as intolerable. During these periods, the country had a response: Reconstruction. The Reconstruction efforts were not without their flaws, but without them, the U.S. would not have made what the racial progress it has today. Another Reconstruction is needed to avoid wasting the promise of its predecessors. The first Reconstruction came during the Civil War's aftermath, but the concept of Reconstruction, that is what would a post-war reunified America would look like, was being discussed even before the opening shots were fired at Fort Sumter. If another union is formed, said one newspaper wrote in 1861, the slave states can have no part in it except on the principles of entire and perfect equality. Not surprisingly, this emphasis of that first Reconstruction was on the South. Ratified shortly after the war, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, thereby ridding the South of its slave bonus in the House of Representatives and the joke of the Electoral College. Then, in fairly quick succession, the 14th Amendment bestowed citizenship on the newly freed, and Congress forced the South to refranchise African American men. Before the 15th Amendment extended the franchise to men nationwide. The scale of progress ushered in over a decade was so consequential that historians have termed the era America's second founding. And yet, Reconstruction was an abysmal failure, subverted by policymakers whose acts and omissions made clear that America was given up on black people. First off, financial investment in the project was grossly inadequate, all but guaranteeing that 4 million enslaved people would remain at the mercy of erstwhile petty tyrants. The Compromise of 1877, moreover, led the federal government to withdraw troops from the South prematurely, which emboldened regional actors to perpetuate campaigns of violence, intimidation, and political domination against African Americans. And the Supreme Court, hell-bent on eviscerating the Reconstruction Amendments in the name of states' rights and constitutional colorblindness, they issued a series of opinions that failed to vindicate black liberty. Any aspirations of entire and perfect equality were relegated to a footnote in history, and the 14th and 15th Amendment dead letters. W.E.B. Du Bois may have put it best: the slaves went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, but then a new slavery arose. Jim Crow had taken a sledgehammer to the edifice of a multiracial society, and for decades the nation stood idle to the destruction, and even wallowed in the detritus. The sorely needed second Reconstruction came in the middle of the next century, though its timing is less neatly bounded. Some historians trace it back to 1948 when President Harry Truman issued the executive order desegregating the military. Others suggested that it began when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. Most places it starts between those two events. At the Supreme Court's 1954 decision on Brown v. Board of Education, they all but agree that the second Reconstruction was erected on the foundation of the first. The 14th and 15th Amendments were lifted from abeyance and soon became the basis for much of the federal government's equality agenda. The success of the second Reconstruction proved that lawmakers had learned some lessons from the failures of the first. To start, the vote was expanded dramatically, even nationally. Federal measures, most notably the 1965 voting rights, put the U.S. on a path toward becoming a true democracy. What occurred in the course of a decade was not only the reenfranchisement of African Americans, but the abolition of nearly all remaining limits on the right to vote. The Harvard historian Alexander Keesar wrote, "Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, pauper exclusions, and good character provisions have been swept away, increasing the size of the electorate by more than 20 million people." Another distinction between the post-Civil War Reconstruction and that of the mid-20th century is that the latter's civil rights agenda was coupled with an economic agenda. To be sure, the Johnson-era domestic policies, known as the Great Society, were not uniquely targeted towards black Americans, but unlike many programs of its forerunner, FDR's New Deal, the Great Society's healthcare, education, housing, and economic development initiatives envisioned black participation, and with committed federal funding, the programs designed to benefit the common the Commonweal began to lift many out of poverty, and it helped expand the black middle class. Finally, in this second Reconstruction, unlike in the first, the Supreme Court moved alongside advocates for progress, and sometimes ahead. The Warren Court did its share to sustain the momentum of the second Reconstruction by ruling on the side of equality and upholding federal measures designed to further it. The court took the lead by outlawing discrimination in schools and transportation hubs, as well as political machinists aimed at submerging black voters. When pressed by the civil rights movement, the executive branch racked up some crucial wins in Congress, most notably the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and the court affirmed them. With the federal government and civil society working in tandem, the gains of the second Reconstruction could be more durable than that of the first. So even so, the second Reconstruction soon came to an end. Whereas the Compromise of 1877 marked the swift and dramatic demise of the first Reconstruction, the second faded away slowly and quietly. Johnson's war on poverty morphed into Nixon's war on drugs. Federal programs were defunded and disbanded as cities deindustrialized, and color blindness came back with a vengeance, with claims of reverse discrimination in the fields of education and employment. In the 1978 Bakke case, for example, the Supreme Court called societal discrimination and the amorphous concept of injury as if it were ignorant of racism's origins, existence, and effects. By dismantling the success of the Civil Rights Revolution and the Great Society, conservatives issued a sardonic reply to the civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, who had asked, "What is the value of winning access to public accommodations for those who lack the money to use them?" Dog whistle politics also came to prominence because a certain word was no longer acceptable to utter. The mastermind of the Southern strategy instructed conservatives to code switch, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights. Lee Atwater, a top Reagan and George H.W. Bush advisor, later admitted, "Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all the things you're talking about are totally economic things, and they are a byproduct of them. And blacks get hurt worse than whites." This approach had its intended effects because racism stopped rearing its ugly face. The George Wallaces and Bull Connors and even police dogs, white Americans could psychologically and legally detach themselves from the nation's racist underpinnings with a no-clan intimidated lynchings to point to. Black people could be hung out to dry. As the white word shift and policy continued to clip the wings of the second Reconstruction, racial inequality soared. Circumstances in the 1990s and the 2000s began to make this painfully clear. The tough on crime era has left untold hundreds of thousands of black Americans wasting away in prisons. The bungled response to Hurricane Katrina, which flattened a predominantly black major American city, had an impact that extended far beyond the nearly 2,000 people that it left dead. And the Great Recession made an already ballooning racial wealth gap, one that matches the 1968 levels, even more persistent. The need for Reconstruction pressed upon the country once again. Then came a herald. President Barack Obama. Obama's election was both problematic and promising. It was problematic because it allowed the country to applaud itself for being post-racial. That is, Obama's election reinforced the fiction that America is no longer colorblind to society. But it also showed promise that the multiracial political coalition that Bayard Rustin wrote about was possible. Indeed, the Obama presidency could have marked the beginning of a third Reconstruction. While it did not meet its full potential substantively, it was big history that delivered rhetorically, and it positioned his successor to lead the country to the apex of the mountain and toward the promise. And of course, that opportunity was squandered with the election of Donald Trump, who governs as though we're in the nadir of a second redemption. This long legacy of racism has salience. During the current COVID-19 pandemic, black Americans have unequal access to health care and housing, while being overrepresented in the low-paid essential employment. Factors that contribute to their suffering from the virus disproportionately. America's sharp racial fault lines have proved an all-too-convenient path for the disease to follow, even after the pandemic subsides. That trail will be littered with signs of the coronavirus's wreckage, and yet this dismal times, as the virus rages and historic protests continue in the wake of George Floyd's slaying, it can be the springboard for a third Reconstruction. So what is needed for a successful third Reconstruction? Perhaps it begins with the sweeping criminal justice and voting reforms that could transform the United States from the world's leading carceral state into a truly multiracial democracy. It might also entail direct investments in black communities to guarantee stable housing, universal health care and high-quality education, necessities for achieving a more inconclusive economy and greater wealth parity. But whatever its shape, a third Reconstruction must rekindle the aspiration of a nation molded in the ideal of a perfect equality, understanding that thinking big and going big too is the surest way toward a more perfect union. Success also demands that nation leaders heed some lessons. The next period of Reconstruction must contend with the effects of the prior era's deconstruction. America's undoing of interim progress has only added to the weight of history and an increased burden for future generations. The unmitigated injury of slavery and racism did not end well with the abolition of the Civil Rights era. Instead, the interest on debt, its impact has compounded. The upshot of this is that it continued inaction and delay amount to opportunities that were lost, and it will also make a racial justice even more difficult to achieve. In addition to a third Reconstruction, it will require many things, three of them vital: truth, reconciliation, and recompense. And at no point in American history has there been a major national effort toward achieving any of these things separately, much less collectively, but we have no shortage of models for doing so. Many governments and universities have inquired into their ties to mass atrocities. The United States, too, should establish formal means to unearth and understand the enormity of the state-sanctioned repression, dispossession, exploitation, and violence toward black Americans, as well as the extent to which the remains of those ills persist in our economic, political, and legal systems today. Only then will the nation be primed to engage in the long-overdue discussion about how to restore the human dignity stolen and to repair itself. On this, too, there is no scarcity of ideas. The task will be made much more difficult because we suffer from a collective amnesia, and now operate in a post-truth world, but with accurate accounting of penance for the original sin and its potency, we will get nowhere. History has revealed a recursive white weariness from trying to solve the Negro question. The work of Reconstruction will be less exhausting and the results far more stable. If everyone participates in crafting this solution, it's not enough for elites to design a project and dictate its terms and conditions. Instead, achieving meaningful progress will require us to join together in the work of remaking this nation, block by block, brick by brick, calloused hand by calloused hand. And finally, on colorblindness, acknowledging race is necessary. Identifying its impact is necessary. Drawing on it to fashion a solutions to problems caused by solution to problems caused not by black inferiority but systems infected with virulent mutating strains of white supremacy is necessary. The Supreme Court may have dismantled Plessy v. Ferguson, but through its insistence on the charade that it's constitutional colorblindness, it has warped the 19th century conception of progress, and it has left 21st century Americans leaning on a faulty pillar. Healing racial wounds may demand race-sensitive ointments, and a successful third Reconstruction requires us to pursue this possibility. Viruses may not discriminate, but unfortunately U.S. policy does. The destruction from COVID-19, as Martin Luther King Jr. might have said, is exposing evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws, and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. And it has been said that life has no do-overs when it comes to Reconstruction. We can only hope that's wrong, and if it is, we will have to undertake the deep self-examination and be prepared to control and confront some hard truths and remain open to substantial remedial action. The country cannot afford to lose a third chance to get things right this time.